Welcome to Act and Unwind, an ongoing conversation on a free and virtuous society. I'm your host, Dan Huger. Eric Cohn is out this week. Thank you for listening. I want to ask that if you're listening to us on our website, that you navigate to the show notes for this episode to find a link to subscribe directly to Act and Unwind at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to find podcasts. And if you like this program, please leave us a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts so as to help more people find the show. This week, I'm joined by Dylan Pahman, Acton Research Fellow and Executive Editor of the Journal of Markets and Morality, and John Pinheiro, Director of Research here at Acton. Today, we'll be talking about the role of technology in education and life, and an innovative scholarship program at the Franciscan University of Steubenville, which seeks to curb its excesses in modern student life. First, however, I want to begin our discussion in the United Kingdom, where last week, October 20th, Liz Truss resigned as Prime Minister. I can't imagine a better way to tee up our conversation of the latest political earthquake to come out of the United Kingdom than the words of Reverend Richard Turnbull, who wrote this last Friday for the Acton Institute's Power blog, quote, "Boris Johnson, though deeply flawed, was the glue that held the British Conservative Party together. His electoral reach, charisma, and commitment to deliver Brexit put together a huge majority of 80 seats over all other parties combined in the 650-seat House of Commons. But that glue came unstuck owing to Boris's own character flaws, and now, in the resulting chaos, the Conservative Party itself has come apart at the seams, squandering the largest parliamentary majority in recent times. Cabinet ministers fell like stones. Members of Parliament demanded the reversal of the vote of the membership. The Prime Minister herself changed policy on issues day by day, hour by hour. Unable either to command her party or deliver on her electoral mandate, Liz Truss resigned on October 20th, just 45 days in office, the shortest premiership in British history." End quote. This show's regular host, in fact, Eric Cohn, a resident of Grand Rapids, was actually in the United Kingdom for about 7% of Liz Truss's tenure as Prime Minister. Gentlemen, what do you make of this news?
As an American, I have no inside, line on what's going on in Britain outside of what I'm reading in the news. But I do think it factors into a lot of what we've seen just in conservatism in the West as a whole. And I think British politics are at least a little more like American than continental Europe. And I think that Reverend Turnbull did a great job kind of parsing the three different constituencies involved here, that you have kind of the classical liberal pro-market sorts, you have the social conservative anti-immigration pro-Brexit sorts, and then you have kind of just the party elite and, the people who are there to advance maybe some kind of agenda, but mostly to advance their careers. I think you see a fracturing happening in Britain with the resignation of Truss and with the breakdown of Johnson's premiership before that, that mirrors a little bit of what we've seen in the United States. We've talked previously on this podcast about efforts to build a new American coalition with some of the national conservatives, people like Yoram Hazony and others in their conferences. And I think you see a similar thing happening, and it really raises the question to me, a really interesting question, because the conservatives are still in charge in the UK, and Republicans do still win elections here in the United States, not to equate republicanism and conservatism, but there is a base, a membership, a voter base for it, and that voter base is just continually more and more out of sync with party leadership, both in the UK and in the United States. And so we'll see. It was just announced today, the new prime minister. It's basically, Turnbull points him out as kind of the members of parliament's pick, not really the voters' pick, or the people's pick. And so they're if you want to put it in terms I don't always like, but the elites are kind of getting their way now, and we'll see how that pans out.
When we talk about political parties, where I like to start, and I guess I should preface my comments as well by saying, as an American, I don't have an inside scoop on UK politics, nor do I really have a dog in the fight. But also, as an American, and thinking as an American who's also an historian, I recognize that our moral and legal and political traditions descend through the British primarily, and so there's just this kind of attraction that Americans seem to have to British politics, and particularly, despite the revolution, to the English royal family. But in this case, thankfully, we're not talking about royalty, are we? We're just talking about Parliament. Political parties are coalitions. In parliamentary democracies, sometimes it takes coalitions of parties to rule, but not in the case of the Tories, the Conservatives. So the interesting thing here for me is that we can talk about potential realignment among conservatives and those laying name to conservatism in the United States. At the same time, we can talk about it in Italy. At the same time, we can talk about it in the UK. And so across the Western world, there's something, and this is what we ought to be thinking the most about, there's something or a number of things that has divided these traditional coalitions that once were able to cooperate with one or two or three primary goals, and they could cooperate, and now they can't seem to. And this is something Reverend Turnbull talks about in his great essay as well. Trying to hold that together. The working people who would have voted Labour before, but then they kind of like Johnson and Brexit, and now where did they go? The working people who maybe in the 1980s would have been Democrats who voted Reagan, then they became Democrats who voted Trump, and now where are they going to go? I would agree with Dylan that we want to be careful to call the American Republican Party conservative, but clearly that's their natural base, people who would identify that way, much like the Tories. But I'm not sure how conservative Tory governance has been either.
Yeah. I mean, and it's important to remember, and Reverend Turnbull gets into this, that Liz Truss was a compromise candidate. But she was regularly described in the media as part of a sort of classical liberal or neoliberal wing of the Conservative Party. That's partly correct, as she did see economic growth as sort of an essential part of what she wanted to accomplish in her premiership. And her proposed agenda involved tax cuts, deregulation, increased immigration. But as Reverend Turnbull also pointed out in his piece, that also involved continuing government spending that's been at its highest levels in living memory. Does the implosion of the British government, fueled in part by a negative market reaction to her agenda, mean the death of neoliberalism or classical liberalism as a political program? Dylan, you raised the specter of folks on the new right. A lot of those folks see this as like a vindication of their critiques of this earlier liberal tradition. What do you make of that?
Neoliberalism is dead. Long live neoliberalism. This is one of these weasel words. It's kind of a black box. People like to throw in everything they don't like about the current world. And actually, one of the most interesting shifts, at least in American politics, but I think I've seen at least a continental trend for this as well, is to just drop the neo and start critiquing liberalism in general, as if it wasn't already bad enough to have a weaselly black box term that people were just filling with whatever meaning they want. Now it's the entire liberal tradition that somehow is, it's almost very Marxist, that it has all these internal contradictions, or is this 31 flavors can just be distilled into vanilla, and whatever people want to characterize it as. So I would say no. There's a lot of forces that to be charitable. The most coherent definition of neoliberalism that I can think of would be like something like the Washington Consensus, pro-market and development, maybe also paired with a kind of hawkish foreign policy. So you put those things together, and Yeah, you're going to get differences of degrees, but I think you're still going to get a lot of Western governments operating with a similar sort of paradigm, for better and worse. So I would say no. But we'll see. I mean, that's kind of always the case. So neoliberal, to be clear, like people think Obama's a neoliberal. People think, it's the sort of thing that cuts across parties. It's not particularly conservative. It might be that the way forward for the left in Britain is to reclaim neoliberalism for their side, right? If the conservatives can't hold it together, rather than simply them falling apart being an indictment of or the death knell of this kind of policy and way of operating.
So this is an arbitrage opportunity for New Labor.
Maybe
new labor. If major parties are coalitions, if they are, and I think they are, then one of the things Dylan points out here, I think, is true, and that is that if you're going to that labor, the conservatives, on all sides, there's constituencies out there to be had, and just because they've existed primarily in one party rather than the other for years doesn't mean they're going to remain there, whether that's American politics or British politics.
Yeah. I mean, the labor voters who are voting conservative, I mean, we see similar. Again, I don't want to equivocate. There's differences in the right and the left between the United States and Great Britain, but there was a phenomena of Obama-Trump voters here in the United States, right? And arguably, they were just this group of people, maybe conservative social values, but kind of economically protectionist or nationalist, that Hillary Clinton could not successfully appeal to, or did not successfully appeal to. And you see similar things in Great Britain. What's interesting to me is in both cases, that's kind of new, right? I mean, that's maybe the last 5 years you have Brexit and you have Trumpism and, that kind of brand of conservatism. And if anything, my question is, are we reverting to the mean, which would be a more neoliberal sort of approach from the right and the left?
Yeah, and some historical context, I think Dylan gave a very good sort of working definition of neoliberalism. But if we go back to the Walter Lippmann Colloquium, and this is after the First World War, this is bringing together economists, thinkers who realized we were increasingly asking government to do more. And they saw some merit to that in terms of a robust social safety net, in terms of government support for education and that sort of thing. But they also saw the dangers in that to a free society. And how could they thread the needle to maybe have a more robust state than the sort of classical liberal 19th century example of how a free society was cultivated, while addressing the concerns of mass democracy and these new phenomena that we saw in the 20th century. One of the tensions, yeah, John.
No, neither of the major parties, but particularly the Conservative Party in Britain now, could we qualify them as small government in some sort of Thatcher-like way, can we? And so why did Truss not last very long? Well, because what she tried to do was take people who were drunk on free money and pull it back, and that's just not going. It wouldn't work in the United States. It wouldn't work in Britain. But I think that the spigot has been much more open in Britain for several decades compared to the United States, and this is why you can talk about low taxes in the United States, and maybe somebody's still going to vote for you, but it's a little bit more difficult, it seems, for Truss to have accomplished that. I'm going to spend more and tax less, and people can do math.
Yeah. And we're in a very different world in terms of levels of government debt that we look in the United States and in the entire Western world. We're looking at much more highly leveraged societies across the board, both with consumer credit and with state spending. Now, 2 weeks ago, which, as we've learned since, is like a decade in British politics.
It's like dog years, isn't it?
Yeah. John O. McGuinness at Law and Liberty wrote a very thought-provoking piece entitled New Avatars of the Right. And he writes, quote, "There is a battle going on across the West about the nature of the right. Should it reflect more of the right liberalism of Thatcher and Reagan, or more of the national right, sometimes called right illiberalism, as defined by leaders like Viktor Orban? This fall has seen the selection of two female prime ministers, Liz Truss of Great Britain and Giorgia Meloni of Italy, on opposite sides of this divide. End quote. In this piece, Truss is characterized as a right liberal, while Meloni is someone with roots, quote, on the nationalist corporatist right, end quote. What does the failure of the Truss government tell us about the future of American conservatism and the right more generally in this sort of contest between differing versions of the future of the right?
Well, I mean, I think, John already mentioned, she wanted to cut back spending and taxes, but very quickly walked back the spending part of that. And, there is just that kind of purely economic right agenda. Again, maybe more so in Great Britain and the United States, although I would be surprised to see it successful in the United States. It's just not very popular. It doesn't hold itself up. And I think that was part of McGinnis's piece and pointing to the situation in Italy, where you have kind of the opposite, very much a social conservative, talking about family before market and state, right? Using that sort of rhetoric, something that we hear a little bit among our national conservatives and integralists here. Something that I think is important. Family is integral to every nation, and it should not be endangered by state power or market forces. On the other hand, that rhetoric can mean a lot of things, and it doesn't mean more liberty necessarily. In Italy, it means, a more expansive welfare state for the family, or, supposedly pro-family or pro-church policies. And that's different than reining back policies. And the question he raises, and I think it'll be interesting to see if it gets put to the test, is whether the opposite can be true in Italy, right? Can you just have that social conservative agenda without the fiscal responsibility that goes with it? I think the two have always needed each other. I think the idea that, despite the fact that, of course, it was a coalition, but the idea that fusionism has no internal coherence, I think, is wrong. I think, Acton affiliate Stephanie Slade wrote a great piece a few years ago now about the philosophy of fusionism. And there is a coherence to it. If you care about families thrive in free markets. We have good data for this sort of thing. If you care about markets, well, you actually need intact, healthy families, right? The kind of core values of social conservatism augment and form that foundation needed for the economic liberalism that's associated with the economic right. So we're seeing people trying it, and of course we've tried it a little bit in the United States with Trump to go more in the protectionist direction, less in the economically liberal direction. And I don't think it's worked very well for housing prices. I can tell you that. Something that matters to a lot of families out there. We have tariffs on Canadian lumber. Why? There's just a lot, and so we're not building new homes, and so housing prices are skyrocketing. That hurts families. It's not just a matter of the bottom line for builders, although that matters too, because guess what? Builders have families. But so, I mean, we can look at this in a lot of directions, but I think we're putting to the test whether or not it's actually coherent to separate these elements. And at least in Britain, the answer seems to be no.
Yeah, I think separation is the big question. So if those Can those that is fiscal conservatism, as we used to say in the 80s, also do they have to be in the same party or coalition with the social conservatives, which in Italy would concern those also who love the church and who see the EU as a threat to the dignity of the human person and to the family and to what it means to be an Italian. But then, of course, Italy, as a founding member of the EU, is going to have it's complex, as we should say. So, can you separate those? I think if we start with the human person and progress out to the family and talk about principles like subsidiarity, well, then no, you can't separate those. Not in principle. But when it comes to long-term policy, I think what Truss ran up against, at least in the UK, is that you can't step back with a very sudden shift in today's political climate, either in the United States or in Great Britain, or anywhere else for that matter, where there has been an open spigot of relatively free money loaned out to the people. You can't do it in the United States. You can't do it elsewhere. The families who are being hurt by some of the government policies Dylan alluded to, and others, including this connects to the college loan crisis, et cetera. It's a real easy sell to say in a democracy and to get votes that I will just pay off your debt, right? I'll pay off your debt. That's the hardest thing for you. You know what you need? You need free daycare until 6 p.m. at night. This was one of the old Tory ideas to promote family, right? You'll just have daycare all day. You won't be around your children, but at least it'll be free while you're working to pay the exorbitant tax bill. I mean, these are the kind of the real world problems you're going to run up to trying to make policy here.
Yeah, and I think it's important when you take a step back at this that all of these factors are intertwined. That what we have are not false problems, that we just need the political will somehow and they're overcome. But these are real problems and challenges in the way economies are structured, in the way that we have levels of debt that we haven't, in the way that we have trade barriers. All of these things, we've seen around the West, we've had three things: housing, healthcare, and education that are that we've seen sort of endemic price rises, in part because we keep subsidizing demand in all sorts of ways. And we close off avenues to sort of innovate out of those problems with entrenched interests. But I think there is something to both of these movements, and I think you're right that it's a mistake to separate them. Last week, the economist Tyler Cowen wrote a fascinating piece that sort of really dovetails nicely into this conversation called "Classical Liberalism versus the New Right," and he characterizes the main difference between the classical liberals and the New Right as, quote, how much faith each group puts in the possibility of trustworthy, well-functioning elites, end quote. But he also sees a fundamental similarity. Quote, the New Right doesn't entirely reject the basic principles of free market economics, but it does try to transcend libertarian views with a deeper understanding of the current power structure. In each case, there are sociological forces operating that are seen as more important than mere free market economics. In this regard, the New Right is more interdisciplinary in its worldview than most classical liberals. The New Right thinkers regard most power as cultural in nature, rather than as rooted in the coercive power of government alone. Does this analysis seem plausible? What are the fault lines between these movements? And is there a possible sort of deep synthesis that folks on both sides of this divide overlook?
I usually like Tyler Cowen and find him very insightful, but I think he's got this very backwards in a lot of ways, actually. I don't see the New Right as having less faith in elites. They complain about elites more. So in that sense, sure, they don't like the current elites we have, but their solution is we just got to be the elites, right? As if power won't corrupt them too. Whereas I see the classically liberal position is embracing, Lord Acton's dictum that power tends to corrupt. That's why it supports things like checks and balances in government and division of powers and free markets. So I don't entirely buy into that. I mean, I see it's not that there's no merit to what he's saying, but I find the framing problematic. And I think the point I would give him is that there is a more of an interdisciplinary emphasis on the New Right. with the exception of the discipline of economics, because they don't seem to care very much about that at all or know very much about that at all. And I think the classical liberal right, the kind of center right to which I identify most with, ought to at least take this as a reminder that, hey, you can't just be economic libertarians and just presume that's going to be enough. It isn't enough. Again, trying to separate out the components of the old fusionist coalition is, in fact, more incoherent, at the very least, than keeping them together. So, I mean, that's kind of my hot take on that, I suppose. But that was my impression, that I don't quite entirely buy that analysis.
Bureaucracies are faulty because people are faulty. I was reading Walter Bagehot just this morning on this very topic, and that is that what's wrong with bureaucracy is what's wrong with us. So if we think that we can get our elites into power and we'll behave differently, that's a danger. People often think they know how they would deal with power having it. Those are people without power. But you don't know till you have it, right? And so there's a sense where we want to ask, so what's most in accord with human nature? And who is most aware of human nature? Well, the person who's worried about the power corrupting them already. The person who's promoting the types of institutions that are geared towards disallowing power from individuals or individuals to amass that kind of power, and asking what's good for the person. Now, when Cowan says that the new right thinkers regard most power as cultural in nature and not rooted in coercive government alone, I think he's onto something that the new right's actually correct about, and that is the influence of culture on the human person, or what we could talk about what Tocqueville called mores. We could talk about the power of custom and tradition to bind us in ways that laws don't. People break a lot of laws. At least when I drive to work, I see it quite a bit, right? But the people breaking those laws, they're probably not going to show up, I hope, to a job interview in sweatpants, not shake hands. I think shaking hands is coming back from what I can tell from recent events. But those kinds of things that are just customary, we do. And we do them because we're bound in a different way than just because positive law is telling us we have to do that, right? And so I think at least the right has correct that culture really matters, that it isn't just a matter then of saying we need a balanced budget and low taxes and everything's going to work out just great.
So my problem with them, though, is these are the same people, or at least some of them are the same people, who very much applaud former President Donald Trump for just saying what he means, and flaunting, all propriety. And so I find the analysis backwards. I think, these are people who, he says, they're more comfortable with restrictions on speech. I think, if anything, they're pretty hardcore free speech advocates to a fault, to some degree. I mean, I don't think we need laws against, certain kinds of speech, but I do think propriety matters. Adam Smith pointed out, as John just pointed out, that you got to start with these basic courtesies, and that's how you actually form some kind of a moral sense within you and a moral culture that serves as the ecosystem for virtuous behavior. So that's a small pushback, I guess, but I just don't see it. I mean, these people will maybe hypocritically shake your hand and smile and be polite when you meet them, but when they got a microphone in front of their face, they're very happy to just throw all that stuff under the bus. So, maybe there's a disconnect between the message and the messengers, but their rhetoric, at least, does not seem to promote what I think is a very essential foundation of a moral culture, which is propriety.
There's gradations of that have been exacerbated by social media and technology. So you're right. You can meet one of these people in a coffee shop, have a great conversation, and you come away thinking, we agree on so much. How are we not political allies? How are we not allies in this? And then you see them behind a microphone and it's different. And then you look at their Twitter feed.
Yeah.
And it's down a level from the microphone. Right?
Yeah. My sort of thought and I'm much more sympathetic to Cowan's analysis than Dylan is. But one of the things that brought to mind was that there is a history in libertarianism of an analysis of power. There's a class analysis. If you look at people like Frederick Bastiat, plunder is not just a rhetorical flourish. He believes that there are people that seize the state to their own ends and exploit it to their own ends. One of his projects that he never got around to in his tragically short life was a history of plunder. And so there is, I think there is a legitimate critique of elites as not merely ignorant, but sometimes malicious. I think it's wrong to overlook that ignorance, and I think there's a lot we have in public choice economics. There's a lot we have that can assess, it's not all malice either. And I think that when you refuse to consider the possibility of both, you end up with some serious blinders, and you end up with these sort of rhetorical excesses that John has pointed to. I think that's very, very true. And I'd encourage all three of these pieces that I featured. This was one of those days when I was putting together what to talk about. I was like, there's some real synchronicity here, and I think this is part of a larger ongoing conversation that we've all been part of for a long time. It's a current event, but I think it points to real fissures in our times, and we need to think through these things carefully and not merely devalue and dismiss, as Tyler Cowen would say, our ideological opponents, as tempting as that can be. Now, John also pointed to a technological angle to what he thinks is the breakdown of trust, of putting the best construction on others. And as we shift from the political to an explicit interrogation of the question concerning technology, the Acton Institute's own indomitable Sarah Negri brought this to my attention last week, that there is a new scholarship available to students at her alma mater, the Franciscan University of Steubenville, which launched just this last month, called the Unplugged Scholarship, which awards financial assistance to students who give up using smartphones for the duration of their undergraduate studies. Franciscan University's Vice President of Advancement announced, quote, "This scholarship will help our students to focus on the heart of this formation, relationship with the Lord and each other. As our scriptural theme this year reminds us, we are called to freedom to serve one another through love," end quote. Noelle Marion, writing for Newsweek, did some reporting on sort of the early dividends of this for students. Quote, Tim Delaney, Executive Director of Alumni and Constituent Relations at FUS, reports that the initial meeting included comical woes such as having to ask a stranger for directions, as well as serious triumphs. One young man confided to the group that not having his phone was proving to be the beginning of the end of a struggle with pornography. A young woman spoke of the diagnosis and long battle with anxiety and depression, and the alleviation of both after having been smartphone-free. Living daily life without the endless stream of information, comparison, insecurities, and scattered attention that comes with smartphones proved to be far more curative than anyone might have imagined, end quote. What do you make of this new initiative as a way forward for education? And indeed, if the upside's to believe, this is dividends for all of life.
Well, the young man who had to stop and ask a stranger for directions. This is interesting. I think about the innumerable marriages that have been improved because the man no longer has to be convinced to stop and ask for directions, but simply can consult the GPS. So maybe this cuts both ways. But more seriously, what I heard of this scholarship, The first thing I thought of was a book that's used quite a bit by the administration at Sacred Heart Academy in Grand Rapids, this classical academy in Grand Rapids. And it's The Tech-Wise Family by Andy Crouch, published by Baker Books, also in Grand Rapids. I guess like the Chamber of Commerce for Grand Rapids today. But the Tech-Wise Family has a lot of really, really good advice on not being completely anti-technology, not wanting to go back to the Stone Age, so to speak. That's usually for green parties. I think you want to promote that kind of thing, but simply to put it in its proper place and what might that mean? And I see this scholarship as fitting in with that. I think there's some critiques I could offer from the outside, but I think it's a very interesting idea. I know there are places where you leave your cell phone behind entirely, or there's no internet on some campuses. I mean, there's a lot of radical attempts to try to do, in particular, it seems to be the smartphone, not just technology. I mean, I assume they're going to be in rooms at Steubenville that have electric light, for instance.
Yes, yeah.
A good assumption.
Not always. You don't.
Yeah, sure.
Because maybe light it makes us too soft. It should be like the University of Paris when Thomas Aquinas was there. We'll sit on straw and listen to a 6-hour lecture, and that's just the AM hours.
Is the candle, though, too dangerous of a technology to allow us to read at night? That is the question.
Cuts into valuable sleep time.
I've been trying to sleep a little more, and there might be something to that. And I think there might be something to this scholarship. I immediately thought of two ancient Christian kind of moral rubrics, I guess, or schemes of categorization. One is borrowed from the Stoics, but it's East and West. You can find a lot of Christian teachers writing this way. I think you can find it in the New Testament, frankly. It's the idea that the only good in life is virtue, communion with God. The only evil is vice and sin. And everything else is morally indifferent and only good or evil to the extent that it's used for virtue or vice. I think the same is true of cell phones. I was a late adopter of the cell phone. In fact, I only got one, I think, 2 years ago when my phone company refused to provide service for the little flip phone I had.
Smartphone, not cell phones.
Yes, yeah. I had a cell phone, although that was also like my wife, when we first started dating, was like, here, like, signed you up for a cell phone, or whatever. And again, like, it's great to be able to text my wife, hey, I love you, how's your day, that sort of thing. I think you can use technology in very, very good ways, including smartphones. It took me about a year to remember I have Google on my phone so I could actually Google how to get somewhere. And I was like, wow, this is great, right? I have a Catholic Bible app on my phone that I use to try to stay in touch, read scripture when I have a little moment here and there. And it's great to just always have that in my pocket. However, I very intentionally have no social media on my phone. And I don't think that it necessarily corrupts, but there is an analogy, at least, to power. Internet, smartphones, social media corrupts. I don't know what absolute social media would be, but I'm sure it would corrupt absolutely.
Absolute social media is TikTok.
Totalitarian, at least, in origin. So I look at that as there's a Christian paradigm to say this sort of prohibition might not be for everyone, but it absolutely can be beneficial if you see this as an obstacle to virtue. Just like Christians fast from food. We don't think that any food, there's no, we don't have any kosher rules or any other sort of taboo, but we do fast at different times, depending on the tradition, to teach ourselves self-discipline, right? And to learn not to always say yes to every impulse we have, but to say no to ourselves. That's how you actually become self-governing and free in that higher moral sense. So that's the first category. Second category of analysis is moral motivation. So why do we do what is moral? There's a lot of commentary on this, in part commentary on, say, the parable of the prodigal son, as well as other teachings in Scripture. I think also, I'll get to it, but St. John's teaching on love, where you have the prodigal. He tells his father, I want my inheritance. I want to go live whatever life I want, basically saying, I wish you were dead, because that's when you ordinarily get an inheritance. And the father says, all right, that's what you want. Here it is. Go live how you want. And he squanders it, and he ends up feeding pigs And he literally gives himself over to a beastly existence. And now he's longing, if only I could be like the pig, at least I have something to eat, right? And he comes to himself. So he has this fear of not going anywhere else, fear of the consequences of his sin and his poor decisions. And he comes to himself and he says, well, I could go back to my father and maybe I could be one of his hired people, right? His hired servants. And that would be good enough, right? And he gets there, and the father, it turns out, has been watching every day for him to return. He embraces him. Before he can even he gets half of his pre-planned script out. Before he can even get there, the father is like throwing a party, and to the point where the other son is envious and says, how come I don't even get to throw a party for my friends? He says, son, all that I have is yours. You've been with me this whole time. And what they draw out of this is three motivations. There's fear of punishment. That's kind of the lowest moral motivation, but you got to start somewhere. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The next is the desire for reward, and that's kind of so they talk about a slave in the first case. They talk about a hireling or a steward in the second case. And then the last is just to obey the Father out of love, to obey the commandments out of love. And that's the disposition of sonship, or, to be a child of God. As St. John says, love casts out fear. St. Anthony, I think, very artfully put these things together, where he famously said, now I no longer fear God, but I love him, for love casts out fear. You start with that fear of God, but the point is to be a child of God. So they use these categories as trying to get Christians to conceptualize their behavior, that it's, despite often caricatures of Christian morality and eschatology is, it's all about fear of hell, or it's all about wanting some kind of reward in heaven. Really, the purest version of the Christian life is that life of love. And to the extent that smartphones can be a temptation for anyone, but perhaps especially the younger people, it's interesting to see these play out. So at Steubenville the Franciscan University of Steubenville was inspired by Wyoming Catholic University. Wyoming Catholic has a prohibition on smartphones. Students are not allowed to have them. So that is a fear of punishment as the motivation. The scholarship is a reward. If you volunteer to not have a smartphone, you will be rewarded with a scholarship. 30 students receive the scholarship, if I have my numbers correct. But what's interesting is 50 more decide to do it anyway. Not for any material reward, but simply for the good of doing what, the perception would be what's good for their soul, right? So for love of the good, they're trying it out as well. And it'll be interesting to see how effective it is in all of these cases. I think in all of them it can be positive. As I said, these are not all negative. They're all varying gradations of good motivation, right? But it'll be interesting to see, is there anyone at Wyoming Catholic that resents the policy? Are there people getting the scholarship who are constantly borrowing their friend's phone to check their social media? How strictly or not are people able to follow this? And is it the sort of thing where, it was great as long as I wasn't at all able to do it, but suddenly now I'm back in the real world and I got a smartphone and I have no self-control because I wasn't actually building self-control. I was just forced to artificially live in the absence of this temptation. So I would love for some enterprising social scientist to do like a longitudinal study on these two schools to see how this pans out.
Dylan, you bring up a very interesting moral question. If we put ourselves into a bubble for too long, and we know we're going to be out of the bubble eventually, then to what degree is that inhibiting our ability to behave virtuously? So in thinking about phones, for instance, I, like you, had a flip phone till fairly recently in the car in case of emergencies, then got a smartphone. And the smartphone's been a very handy tool for me. But I didn't grow up with my face in a screen all the time, and I didn't grow up with smartphones, and I didn't grow up with this idea that if I had a question, I could have an instant answer. And so think about the virtues of not having the smartphone, and I think a liberal arts university like Franciscan University of Steubenville I'm assuming they're thinking about how to grow in wisdom, which is the purpose of being liberally educated. And one of the things we need to do is train our mind to think about information, to consider it, to weigh it, right? To measure consequences, to think prudently, et cetera. And we can't do that if we have the answers at our fingertips all the time. We can't even train our mind to retain information because we have the answers at our fingertips all the time. Think about the difference between an oral culture whose members can remember poems thousands and thousands of lines long, and somebody who says, I feel like I heard that before. And then you Google 3 random words and you come up with it, and that's a very, very different, right? So just memory. So I'm thinking if we already have the wisdom, we can adopt a tool like this and be more likely virtuously to use it. But if the tool itself is preventative of developing that wisdom in the first place, then maybe a scholarship like this can help. But I wonder what life was like prior to college. This is a scholarship in college, after all. On tools themselves, I think of this great exhibit I saw at the Grand Rapids Public Museum that was here last year, and it had a smartphone on one side, and then a very large room containing all sorts of technologies, like maps, like flashlights, all the kinds of things that your smartphone does. And its point was all these things that you could not carry around unless you had 5 servants with packs on their backs. They're all on your phone, and you're carrying it around. I mean, here's your servant. Do I have servants? Yes, I have 12 of them, but they're all on my smartphone. And that's a very handy thing. Just the other day, I was having to air up tires. I couldn't see the little nozzles, pulled out the phone. Sure, I could have carried a flashlight, but I guess I'd be glad that I wasn't at a place where I was forbidden to have a phone. I would have been able to air up my tires. So I don't know if you're going to liberally educate people. I guess I would opt for the Franciscan approach over the more coercive approach. I recall having this argument at Aquinas College when there were some who were looking to ban smoking of tobacco entirely on campus, and some who were saying, I was in the camp and said, look, this is a liberal arts campus. We're trying to liberate people to make free and virtuous decisions, and how can we do that if we make all their decisions for them? I think if we could just start with not having co-ed dormitories,
right?
That maybe we could. Why don't we shoot for fornication free before we shoot for smoke free, for instance?
This is, I think, the value of something like this is the conversations that ensue because of it. When Dylan points out, there's 30 scholarships and yet 50 students join. I'm curious to see if you would have a similar effect if, let's say, a homily was preached on campus about the dangers of. I mean, you have people who report struggling with temptation, presumably for years as a cause of this device that they had been carrying around. People developing depression, anxiety that they attribute to this device. So this is an occasion to think through those things. And I think that is extremely good. And what's most telling to me is that these are religious students attending a religious liberal arts university. And evidently, before this scholarship, at least among some, they had never considered the implications of something that they were literally carrying around in their pocket and how it was affecting them in their life. And I think anytime you can do that sort of introspective turn, that's a very profitable thing. I'm delighted to hear the good news from the students at Steubenville and wish them all the best in that.
It is good news, and you notice it started with an incentive, right? The incentive is the scholarship, and a few sign on. And those are people who want to do it. And then those others just from choice, just from wanting to grow in virtue and wisdom. And that's why I think the scholarship idea is very much a superior approach than a blanket policy. I mean, imagine the student at another college who has an ill parent and wants to have the phone on their hip, for instance. I mean, that's just one example I could think of. So I think the Steubenville scholarship is much more in keeping with a traditional liberal arts idea of liberating you.
So another aspect to this, and I think that we've already drawn out some of these examples, is you have these religious liberal arts schools, and schools are very high population density, right? In fact, my wife is from a town, Winona, Minnesota, that doubles in population over the school year because they have a university there. And when you have people everywhere, you could Google stuff and you might get a more accurate answer, although there is fake and bad stuff on the internet, even when you're trying to get the right answer. Or you could just talk to your neighbor. One of the biggest boosters of the smartphone technology in recent years that I've come across is comedian Arsenio Hall, who in a Netflix special a few years ago, and I'm not going to be able to make this funny like him, but he was talking about how he loves his smartphone. He does everything on his smartphone. He orders food and he, watches movies and he goes on the internet and he sends messages and all of that. He loves it and he loves doing everything with it except for one thing: talking to people, which, for those who don't know, was the original purpose of the phone. But that's the one thing somebody calls, and I have the same experience. Somebody calls, I'm like, why wouldn't they text?
That was the fascinating thing about the car phone, was that you could take a phone call in your car.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, right. But as soon as that text, and Jerry Seinfeld has talked about this as well, another comedian, that as soon as the text was invented, talking was done. No one wants to talk when you could text. Just give me that 5-word text that lets me know what you want. Don't make me find a quiet place somewhere in the corner of my office so I can have this conversation with you. And I think there's immense good to all the convenience that has caused, but it is always worthwhile to ask ourselves what is lost. Even when something's good, it doesn't mean that it comes without a cost. And we've seen, especially in the last 2 years, what happens when you take away face-to-face interaction with other human beings. And it's not good. I don't think the smartphone is necessarily an obstacle to that. But to the extent that it can be, it's great to hear of colleges and students encouraging that face-to-face interaction. I mean, that's part of what fellowship is all about. Again, not to say you can't have that on social media or online platforms or whatever. But if you got someone, if you got roommates, if you got suite mates, if you got classmates, talk to them. Make some friends, introduce yourself, disagree about stuff, get in arguments, have fights. Like that's just part of human relationships. Ask for forgiveness, apologize, repent. That's how you're going to grow in holiness. Hopefully you can also do that online, but I would agree with those who would point out that people on Twitter especially very bad at that. So I wouldn't encourage people, that's like hard mode as far as, I think like monks, the equivalent of St. Anthony today might be someone who's like, I'm going to live only on Twitter. That's where all the temptation is, right? That's where all the nastiness is. I'm going to brave it out there. I don't think most people are well equipped for that hard mode of spiritual formation, at least not in their late teens, early 20s.
Let's call it a wrap there. Thank you for listening to Act and Unwind. If you're listening to this podcast on our website, please look into the show notes for a link where you can subscribe directly to Act and Unwind, or just search for Act and Unwind on your favorite podcast app. Also, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, 5-star reviews only, so that more people can find this program. Thanks to Dylan, thanks to John. For the Acton Institute, I'm Dan Huger, and we'll see you next week.